by the way, this has never happened in public, not anywhere, as far as I know, in the world, where we had this kind of public event, and with commentators who were not part of the Urantia movement, such as Ted Peters, who's about to speak, and Ted will be second on the panel, and for the first person on the panel is going to be my very old great friend Matthew Rapaport, who, when I met him, had just had his BA in biology, I think it was, and he always was a very scientific sort of fellow, but also quite a logical and philosophic mind. So I think of Matthew as very balanced between philosophy, science, and spirituality. He has lately returned to the study of science and cosmology and has a new book out entitled
Why This Universe?
Why This Universe. And that's an ebook that you can find, and he's
on Amazon.
On Amazon. So
$3.99.
So we're going to get a different perspective from a long-time veteran Urantia book reader. It's going to be a little different, and so we'll have a contrasting perspective from the Urantia point of view. And then Ted Peters is outside of this community, but a friend of the community, and he'll be after Matthew. So I'm going to remain nearby, and we'll give you 10 minutes or more if you need
12 minutes.
If you need more, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Everyone hear me okay? All right, so Phil's talk focused a lot on structural concepts of cosmology in the Urantia book, and not so much from much of the specific science that's mentioned, and he did mention some of that, and I'll address some of that also. There's an awful lot of science in the Urantia book, and you're going to hear a view from me that's a little different than some of the other speakers. The Urantia book covers from the local scene on Earth back up to the cosmos tons and tons of details in science, in anthropology, in biology, in evolutionary science, long descriptions of the evolution of life on Earth, in geology, the geological evolution of the planet, including its origins in space, and finally, cosmology, including the nature and origin of star systems and things like this. All of it, and I mean all of it, is to be found in textbooks of the 1910s and 1920s on this planet, and there isn't any other planet that it comes from. Now, much of this work is thanks to a gentleman named Matthew Block. Cover of his book was put up as a picture by Byron in his first talk earlier this morning. Matthew has spent many years searching for the sources. The Urantia book says, hey, we use human sources. And Matthew spent many years searching for these sources, and amazingly enough, he found the sources to 90% of the scientific statements in the book, and not just in cosmology, but in all the sciences. And all of these sources are from the 1910s and 20s. Now, this doesn't mean that what they said, or everything they said, was wrong. For example, human geologists suspected the possibility of continental drift way back in the 1800s. They didn't know at that time, even the 1920s, what could drive such a process. And so it was controversial. And as Phil pointed out, the discovery of what did drive the process wasn't made till the 60s, till after the Urantia book was published. But they didn't need the discovery of the mechanism, and by they I mean the revelators, didn't need the discovery of the mechanism to come down on the right side and say, yeah, there was continental drift. They didn't have to say anything more than that. They let us discover the mechanism 30 or 40 years later. Now, this happens to be the case, in my opinion, with all of the science from the 10s and the 20s of the 20th century that the Urantia book authors happened to get right. And that also means that they made statements to us about these things that were incorrect. Now, Phil mentions Piltdown Man. They avoided that controversy, and they were smart to do so. I'm not saying this stuff was all faked. These people knew what they were doing, and they avoided obvious mistakes. But there were other things they said that clearly today we've gotten beyond. For example, nobody today believes that the dinosaurs became extinct because mammals ate their eggs. We know about the meteor. We know about the iridium layer. The crater is off the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico for anyone to explore if they want to go find it and dive deep enough. The Urantia book unhesitatingly says that the Milky Way galaxy is the superuniverse of Orvonton. That's just not the case, and no cosmologist who's into cosmology in the Urantia book today actually believes that. So, as far as the authoritative reduction of error, the Urantia book also says that this is a transient phenomenon. It is transiently valuable that we do this for you. And Phil mentions this, but I think he rests too much weight on that statement. They were authoritatively reducing error by organizing even 1920 science in such a way that we understood that there was an evolution to the cosmos. And I think all of the science that they give us in the Urantia book is given in the service of describing an evolutionary story. And by evolution, I don't just mean the evolution of life on Earth, Darwin, which they certainly go into, but also the evolution of the cosmos as a whole. The Urantia book portraits an evolutionary universe outside the central universe where God personally resides. God is absolute, God is infinite, God is complete. God knows everything. He knows the beginning of everything. He knows the end of everything. A minister friend of mine, who some of you know, once said, God not only knows everything you've done, and He loves you, He knows everything you're going to do, and He still loves you. So, the point is, the Urantia book has this contrast between an infinite God who is outside of time and knows everything, no surprises, and a space situation, a time-space domain, which evolves in every possible respect. It evolves cosmologically, it evolves biologically, it evolves socially. And that social evolution is what we are all about. The appearance of enough biological junk in here, a brain, to make contact with cosmic mind allows God to rest a personality on that complex brain. And that personality subsequently is enabled. Doesn't have to do this. There are plenty of atheists out there and plenty of people who do evil things all the time, but it is the potential of every person to choose to participate in God's plan, and that is the point of this evolution, that we all learn to choose it. Now, the Big Bang. This is the big one. So the Urantia book is really kind of inspecific about how the whole universe and all these galaxies and the millions of outer space galaxies all come to be. It's implied that they sort of all slowly grow there together, with the super universes currently inhabited as being older and growing up earlier, and these outer space universes still forming but eventually to be inhabited when this universe level is complete. This model was the dominant model idea in cosmology. I mean, without the specific layers and things, but the idea that all of this just grows slowly everywhere in the 1910s, 1920s, and in fact up through the 1950s. Now, the Big Bang was suspected as far back as the 20s and 30s because of the expansion of the universe that was spotted that Phil mentions. But the real evidence for it, the nail in the coffin to steady-state cosmology, came in the 1960s or 70s when the cosmic microwave background radiation was discovered. What this is the latent heat of the Big Bang that we can see all over the sky. And by see, I don't mean with our eyes, I mean with radio telescopes. In fact, those of you who are familiar with the old-fashioned kind of TV that used to get snow on it, about 10% of that snow on a TV is actually the product of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Be that as it may, the math of this radiation, the fact that it had to come from a Big Bang, and it's not exactly an explosion, I'm not going to get into the details, but the mathematics of this are now dead certain. There simply is no way that this phenomenon we call the cosmic microwave background could have emerged from anything resembling a steady-state universe. Now, that being said, there are cosmologists who currently have a problem in the Big Bang, and Phil mentioned it. If the Big Bang was really a random, huge, sudden expansion of space in which all this hot trillion degree heat bath came to be created. It should be smooth, and it is. It's very smooth. As Phil mentioned, the differences in temperature are only a 10,000th of a degree all the way across the sky. But even these differences ought to be spread out smoothly across the whole sky. And guess what? They're not. It's been discovered in the last 8 years or so, and the specifics are getting more finely measured with every new satellite that they send up. It has been discovered that the distribution of these temperature variations is not random. There is a slightly warmer side and a slightly cooler side. There's a slightly warm streak and a slightly colder spot. Now, cosmologists look at this and go, oh no, this is a really big problem. If this bang really happened and imparted the inertial momentum to the whole universe, and I won't get into that, it has to do with time and space, it should have happened evenly everywhere. And the fact that it's not smooth is a big problem for these guys. Oh my, how could it not be smooth? Well, let's not forget, all these guys are atheists. 90% of the cosmologists and the physicists working on this stuff are atheists. And if the theory behind the expansion is that it should have been smooth and it's not, they've got a big problem. However, we don't have that problem. We've got God. If God wants a preferred axis in the universe, and he creates matter-space, space-time, by differentiating it from the absolute, and he does that with a big bang, even if the Urantia book doesn't mention it, what difference does it make? The evidence for the bang is there, and if paradise and the shape of paradise and the fact that the energies of paradise have a direction in space puts its imprint on the bang, big deal. It shouldn't matter to us. If God wants there to be a preferred direction in space, and that preferred direction is imaged, if you will, in the cosmic microwave background, so be it. God can arrange for anything he wants. One of the other big problems with the Big Bang is the very structure of the galaxies that Phil mentioned, the fact that there are sheets of galaxies and seeming gaps in between. None of this kind of phenomenon can be explained as coming out of the Big Bang without God. But since we have God, and since God had 380,000 years to figure, it took 380,000 years from the initial Big Bang until the whole thing cooled enough for matter, and by matter I mean the atoms we're familiar with, to form. God had 380,000 years to arrange the shock waves and the densities and the this and the that in the expanding bubble so that when matter formed, it would crystallize and eventually lump together in stars and galaxies and sheets and this and that and whatnot, exactly the way he wanted it to happen. None of this should be a mystery to us. And there's no reason why we can't accept, in my opinion, the evidence of the Big Bang plus the fact that these unusual phenomena or these mysterious phenomena that are so mysterious to atheist scientists, because to the atheist, this stuff should be random. There shouldn't be a mystery to us that it's not random. Now, I just want to say that the main reason, in my opinion, the Urantia book waited till it did wait to be published and, well, to be delivered, even before the publishing, was that they had to wait until we, as scientists on Earth, had understood enough to be able to grasp their evolutionary story. The point of the Urantia book is that space evolves, and whether it evolves in a steady-state cosmology or a Big Bang or what have you doesn't much matter. The real lesson they're trying to convey to us is that at the same time there is an absolute infinite, omnipotent God who knows everything, all of time, and there's time. And there's creatures like us who are made personal within it, who have to use it and live within it to find their way to cooperation with God's plan. And when all of us creatures find it, and I don't mean just us on Earth, I mean us on all the planets of the 7 super-universes, then will God's purpose for the finite be completed. Then does the Supreme come together as person and power, as a manifestation of God into the finite. And that's how the process works. And we don't have to be committed to the specific science mentioned in the Urantia book in order to get this overall process. And thank you very much. That's where I was going.
Well said, Matthew. Wow.
Thank you.
You can see that there are different schools of thought within the Urantia movement, interpretations that are different of the same information about science and cosmology. And we could have a whole conference, and we probably will, on that subject. So you can see that on the Big Bang, there's a divergence, between different students of the Urantia book. There's a lot more to say on that, but I'm going to turn this now over to Ted, and we'll have time after Ted's presentation to ask everybody questions. So I think you all know that Ted Peters is a professor at GTU, this Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley, and it happens that 20 years ago I wanted to perhaps get a PhD there and write a dissertation about the Urantia book. But I was probably 40 years ahead of my time. I audited a course of his that he taught with Bob Russell on chaos theory and theology, which was life-changing. But I could see after even that one course when I wrote a paper about paradise and what it is in relation to current theology. I could see that I better not study there, and so I became a publisher and started publishing these books you see over there. Anyway, Ted Peters has been a great inspiration, and he's an author of many books that you can find. And I'll just turn it over to Ted Peters. There we go, Ted's timely take. It's a great honor to have Ted Peters here with us.
Well, this morning when Byron gave us that very illuminative lecture and then preceded it with a period of meditation, I was struck by something which is common sense, and that is that we would be thinking in first person, second person, and third person. And I think that's important because that grammar structures the way we think about almost anything. You bring a baby or a kitten in here right now, I'm suddenly going to grab it and hug it, and it's going to be a second person interaction. But I'm an academic, and I'm stuck in the third person. So it's going to be third person for the next few minutes. And I've got a few thoughts on Urantia Cosmology. Basically, Byron gave me a reading assignment. Read these chapters in the Urantia book and respond. And I'm going to raise a question that I think fits what we heard both Phil and Matthew talking about. And my question is Urantia scientific or spiritual? And my answer is going to be spiritual. And let me move forward a little bit. One of the obvious dimensions of Urantia cosmology is its emphasis on space. I think that going back to my youth when I was 11 or 12 years old, I think space got into my soul. Outer space got to my inner soul. And there is something about the natural symbol of space that does something to us. And that beautiful snow leopard that we saw earlier probably doesn't think about this, but we human beings do. And it may be a trick that God is playing on us to make us ask these questions. Our ancestors, during the time in which the Bible was written, didn't ask this question. But they asked a similar one. Imagine yourself in ancient Jerusalem or ancient Athens or ancient Memphis in Egypt, and it's a bright sunny day, and you're laying on the beach, and you're not, you got an hour before your next appointment, and you're just looking at the sky like Charlie Brown does. What do you see? Well, it just looks unending. You can't see the end of it. And you will see powerful things in the sky, such as the sun, especially if you're in Egypt. But if you're in Greece or Israel, you're going to see thunderclouds, and you're going to see lightning, and the sky is just going to be filled with power. So the sky has, for your and my ancestors, elicited within us a sense of infinity and a sense of power. And ancient myths throughout the world that we know of usually have powerful sky gods that fill us with awe. Well, we in the modern world, we don't believe in myths anymore, do we? We don't believe in sky gods. We fly above Mount Olympus and look down where Zeus used to live, right? There are no gods of the sky anymore. We can listen to the weather reporter who will tell us scientifically and meteorologically what the sky is going to do tomorrow. And it doesn't matter how many times the weather reporter is wrong, we still trust that we have conquered the sky. But right behind the sky was another sky. Outer space. And of 20-some astronauts that have flown in outer space, more than half of them have had religious experiences. Mm-hmm. Outer space now does for your and my soul what the sky did for our ancestors. And I want to say that's alive and well and vibrating in the Urantia book. This religious sensibility. So regardless of the specific cosmology that we see there, it's going to have this enormous spiritual resonance for you and me. I use the terms beyond and intimate. I want to say that if you and I are going to think seriously about God, God has to be thought by us as being the most beyond that there can be. There can't be something beyond what we think God is and be satisfied spiritually. And at the same time, God has to be completely and fully intimate. As St. Augustine says, God is closer to me than I am to myself. Okay. So that's my framework now, within which I want to take a look at Urantia. But before, I want you to meet my son-in-law, who's a science teacher. I've got space in my head. And on the one hand, he means it like I do, right? Space in the soul. On the other hand, that's what his students think about him. So, all right, here's a passage now from the Urantia book, and it has to do with what's small. The formation of all matter is on the order of the solar system. Okay, good. We've got that big world out there. Within the atom, the electrons revolve around the central proton with about the same comparative room the planets have as they revolve about the sun in the space of the solar system. So what happens out there in the solar system is happening simultaneously at the subatomic level. And this little discussion earlier about ultimatons and atoms just reminded me, for a long time, scientists look for that fundamental particle beyond which you can't get anything smaller. We finally ended up with elements. That's about as close as we could get. And it was a bad day when they found they could take the atom apart, right? All right. Where have we heard this before in the Urantia book? Well, it's 1913. It's called the Rutherford-Bohr atom. And according to this is where we get the nucleus, and the electron allegedly orbits the nucleus just like Venus orbits the sun. And I remember in college somebody showing me this in their physics book. I was awestruck. Oh my gosh. The smallest things match the big things. Well, in the history of religions, we call that the microcosm-macrocosm correlation, and it's a fundamental way of thinking that begins at least with the rise of city-state culture, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 before the Common Era. And this got to them just as it gets to you and me. And I walked around for 3 days thinking about the Bohr atom and just how marvelous reality is. Well, unfortunately, scientists do change their minds, and Niels Bohr changed his as well, because in the 1920s they had to deal with quantum mechanics, and they discovered that the Bohr model of the atom was no longer adequate. It no longer provided the kind of opportunity for measurement that they needed, so they scrapped it, and they ended up with wave-particle duality in order to deal with those pesky little electrons. But I think that the textbook sellers and publishers found that the old, out-of-date, no longer valid Bohr model was more exciting to readers. And so even when I was in college, they were still in physics books having this model of the atom. Why? Well, because I think the Bohr atom plunked our religious strings in a way that wave-particle duality is such a bore, in comparison. All right, so why am I saying this? I'm saying what you have in the Urantia book looks like science, but I think it's functioning to have a spiritual purpose. All right, take another passage. The universe is neither mechanical nor magical. It is a creation of mind. I just want to pause there in a minute. Think about phenomenologically. You and I know what it's like to create things out of mind. My father was an engineer. He went to work every day to design things that hitherto had never existed in the history of the world. If you're planning a Thanksgiving dinner, you can imagine where everybody's going to sit, where you're going to put the turkey. And okay, there's no question in my experience that mind actually changes things in the material world. It is a creation of mind. The whole universe now is a creation of mind, and a mechanism of law. Mechanisms do not absolutely dominate the total creation. The universe of universes is in toto, is mind-planned, mind-made, and mind-administered. So of the two realities, the physical universe and the mind is the higher. But the divine mechanism of the universe of universes is altogether, now this is the line that I want to focus on, too perfect for the scientific methods of the finite mind of man to discern. All right, let me just say some things that this raises for me. And I know that you can distinguish mind from soul, but in common parlance, they're frequently not discriminated against. At the birth of modern science, we're talking about Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo and Newton. They believe that God has a mind, that this mind is rational, and by God's rational mind, the world was created. And God has given to the human race a mind. And that if we exercise our mind by studying what's going on in the world, we will rethink the thoughts of God. That's how modern Western science was born. Eventually, over the last 200 years, as Matthew was saying, well, you got the atheists coming in, and they lop off the God part. But scientists, physical cosmologists today still believe that the laws of nature that we study here on Earth are operative on the galaxies no matter how far away they are. Now, who was it that saw to it to that? Well, no God. It's just, I guess, the Big Bang saw to it, huh? In some fashion or another. I guess it's almost a question that I'd like to dialogue with you. What do you mean by mind? Is that the kind of thing you mean? We've got alternatives in the contemporary discussion. Mind is a mental substance. We get that from Descartes and the early modern period. And that, of course, corroborated the idea of the immortality of the soul. Much more recently, materialism has come to dominate, and we believe the mind is now an epiphenomenon of the body, and certainly the neurophilosophers, I don't mean the neuroscientists, they do good work. The neurophilosophers are now trying to tell us that the mind is the brain, and when your brain goes, so do you. And the Christian theologians have fortunately had a trump card, resurrection of the body, so might lose the soul, but at least we keep the body. And then there's an alternative, mind as an information pattern, and the transhumanists and the techies like this metaphor, because if the mind is an information pattern, on the analogy of software, and the body is the hardware, we can extract your mind and put it in a computer, and if we keep it plugged in, you can live immortally. So there's a lot going on in mind discussion these days, and in some ways I just want to say, well, what kind of mind do you vote for? Finally, my message for Phil, and in a sense it was my response, I was responsible for responding to Phil, is I think that the fundamental value of the Urantia book is that it plucks our spiritual strings. That is to say, it appeals to our religious sensibilities. I think if you work too hard at trying to show how the Urantia book predicts scientific discoveries, you're building your house on sand. In fact, Phil, I guess I just want to challenge you here. On the one hand, you want to affirm your belief in the Urantia book. On the other hand, you like looking at instance after instance after instance in which what was revealed is now confirmed by science. Tacitly, you're saying, science tells me what's true. And so when you run into a conflict, I think the Bohr atom would be an example of a conflict here, what do? What do you do? And do you really want to allow scientific discussion to falsify your belief? Do you want to put science into that position, especially knowing how fickle science is? Science keeps changing its mind every decade or so. And so if you're going to be talking about eternal truths, do you really want to subject them to falsification or verification by science? That's my basic message. I have another story, but I would need 5 minutes more time, and I don't know if Byron is going to give it to me or not.
Yeah, go ahead, do it.
All right, okay. I marveled when Phil brought up the issue of the center and the periphery and how the problem created by Einstein's theory of special relativity eliminates the center. First observation, I can't help as reading through the Urantia book, another religious sensibility is coming to the fore. That's the center and the periphery. The center is sacred. The periphery is profane in most models. And so when you get to city-states, and just take a look at your European small town, right? In the center is the square. It's not a circle, it's a square. And on one corner is the church, right? You know, you live in Europe. And on the other corner is the Rathaus or the city hall and other important things in the market. It's the way we think. The center is sacred, and the further away from you get from it, the more profane. So now the universe of universes that you get in the Urantia book is structured like a small town in Europe. And it's just a whole lot bigger, and the closer you get to the center, you get to Havona, and you get to the absolute sacred, and it's not even in time and space, but everything else is. Okay. Here's my story about my thoughts, and then I'll get back to Phil. About 20 years ago, I wrote a book on the Trinity, and I asked myself the question, how is God omniscient? How is it that God knows everything? And it was very important to both you guys that God is omniscient in character. And if you live in a Newtonian world, and I really think both of you are in a Newtonian world, you can respond to me here, that you got this big empty container, time and space, and then you dump everything in reality into this container, and of course God can know everything in the container. But Einstein comes along with his special theory of relativity and says, I'm sorry, it doesn't work like that. You don't have a container for time and space. All you have are inertial frames of reference within which time can have a before and an after. But two inertial frames of reference can never have simultaneity. And so this puzzled me because I'm wondering, how can God have omniscience? Because God cannot see things simultaneously if God sees two or more initial frames of reference. And so I lost sleep worrying about God's problem here. And to make it worse, because of the expansion of the universe and some of those distant galaxies are moving away from us at such a high rate of speed, there could never in principle be communication back and forth at the speed of light. And Einstein says in the physical world there's only one absolute, and that's the speed of light. You might say, well, who cares? Well, I looked around to see the theologians who had dealt with this question, and all of them who dealt with this question said, well, God's thoughts travel faster than light. I found that unsatisfying. Because think for a minute about thinking. Our concept of what it means to think is a metaphor built on the concept of light. If it's dark, you're ignorant. If you flip the light switch on, suddenly you can see. So if you're in a conversation and somebody says something complicated, you say, I see. I knew a blind person one time said, I see about 4 times. I said, well, what do you mean you see? You're blind. She said, well, I mean, I understand. Mm-hmm. Okay? So, all scriptures that deal with God as having knowledge use the metaphor of light. The word enlightenment in the West, Upanishad in ancient Sanskrit, right? Enlightenment. So you and I don't even have a concept of what it means to know anything that isn't something slower than light. So I finished my book saying, boy, I can't figure this one out. I hope God has a way of figuring it out. I can't. So I guess the reason what I want to do is I think I heard both of you assuming a Newtonian universe, not an Einsteinian universe. And I want to know how God, especially the Father residing in the center at paradise, can communicate or interact with those super universes that are at such distances. In your mind, do God's thoughts travel faster than the speed of light? Or do you think this is a non-problem that I'm just kind of making up? So, at any rate, thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Ted. That was illuminating, really. Thank you.
Illuminating, yes, that's right.
Light. There was a lot of light that came from that. There was no darkness. And historic. There's really nothing like this has happened, as I pointed out. So we only have, we have like 7 minutes on the schedule. We could alter a little bit. I don't know if, can you stay a little bit longer for your, no, I'm talking to Lawrence. Yeah, a little bit longer. So Lawrence is on at 3:30 for a short time, and then we have a break for 15 minutes. So I want to see what folks think. You want to continue this and have this discussion and we'll miss our break. Mainly, there'll be a short time for bathroom break, and then we have a 4 o'clock talk. So what do you say? Should we? So let's keep going, because we need to all respond to one another here. So it seems to me that you ought to be responding before we get to questions. And I wonder if, I think, Phil, you would be the next respondent, and then Matthew. And then I'm going to let Ted have the last word on that, since he's our special guest. And then we'll have Q&A after that a little bit. Okay, so Phil, why don't you respond?
All right, thank you. Where do I begin? I don't think I remember mammals eating their eggs in the Urantia book.
I don't either.
But you mentioned that. So, number one. The Milky Way galaxy is not said to be equal to Orvonton. What precisely, and I'm a mathematician, careful about precise words and definitions, it says most of what you see in the Milky Way is in Orvonton. That allows there to be a lot more behind it or within it that you can't see.
I just want to ask you to contextualize this. So just for those who are really new to this, so the superuniverse, there's 7 superuniverses. Those are the inhabited units. There's 7 of these. And so we now know, at least I believe, that those are not one galaxy. But in the representations I showed you, it was one galaxy. So your Urantia book readers who don't read this thing really precisely got it wrong. Is that right?
What I'm doing is I'm quarreling about the sort of fuzzy terms. It was stated that Matthew Block has found all of these sources. And that's true. He has found a lot of sources that were used, human sources. However, what wasn't mentioned was that the Urantia book doesn't follow the mistakes of all these sources. It avoids them, specifically avoids mistake after mistake that these authors, even though they use the phraseology or whatever, they avoid the mistakes. The other thing that bothered me about what I heard from Matthew was that he says that, well, you know, this is the way it is scientifically or mathematically, but
We can get an axis, we can get north and south. After all, God can do anything God wants. But that sounds a lot like the kind of explanations that people would give, how did the earth get here? God made it. I mean, you can always say that, but I'm not sure what it answers. Moving on to Ted. I agree with you. The primary message and the meaning and value of the Urantia book is spiritual. And the science is meant to be a temporary help. But if it's going to be a temporary help, it has to really help. It can't just simply be rewarmed 20th century mathematics or science, whatever. The notion that the mind is just the brain, I don't think you've really subscribed to that, but you mentioned that's what, I'm getting down there at San Diego State University, or University of California, San Diego. Whence volition? If the mind is just matter, then it is subject to antecedent causation. Totally. It's just energy. If it's just energy, then everything is predetermined. We have no choice. Well, we all experience having choices. So the mind has to be something more than just matter. It can't be just matter. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be talking about the possibility of a choice. We would just be machines. Machines just do what they're supposed to do. And lastly, science tells me what's true. It does, to some extent. It does tell me what's true. I can verify that something is worth believing if the part that it tells me that I can check, I can validate. If I can validate the science, and I've written the statistical test, I would recommend that you take a look at that and then tell me that the Urantia book somehow is just rewarmed science from the 20th century. One other thing with respect to what you asked about God's thoughts. The Urantia book says that not only is paradise at the center globally, it is at the center locally. So that, and they say that gravity is instantaneous, even though space may attenuate it. So there's no need. There's things in the Urantia book that are simultaneous, that happen instantly. They talk about even gravity traversers. So God is not limited by the speed of light. I don't see any need to worry about the speed of light when it comes to God's ability to communicate with the whole cosmos.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. So I'm now going to turn over to Matthew to respond to both of them.
Oh, okay. Well, my response, first of all, to Phil, I'll search for that business about the mammals. We'll have to find that. Perhaps I'm remembering that wrong. But to me, the issue about the matter of the Urantia book being an authoritative source of science, and that it also says that this is a value for transiently clarifying our understanding. The word transient there is important, and I'm not saying that the authors weren't very clever about couching their language such that many things could be read one way before confirming discoveries and then understood to mean something else or something different, because you suddenly see, oh, they really could have meant that, this that we've now discovered. I don't deny their very brilliance in these matters. But the book says the science presented in this book will have to be revised. The question is when. It's almost been 100 years. In another 6 years, it'll be 2020, 100 years since these sources that Matthew Block found were written. When is enough time enough time? So that's my response to Phil. I want to keep this short. To Ted, I kind of agree with Phil in what he said. Let me just flesh that out in a little more detail. God sees the whole block at the same time. The fact that our language is restricted to spatial and temporal metaphors, like the speed of light, like illumination, has nothing to do with God's mode of knowing things. And that's the big difference. If there is a block, and by block here we're talking about that what Einstein discovered makes it appear is that somebody's past, my past is somebody else's future, and my future is somebody else's past, depending on how far apart you are, how fast you're moving in relation to one another, and whatnot. All of these concepts of what's past, present, and future can vary. And so these relativistic scientists, and I certainly understand, or at least try to understand the impact of relativity on space and gravity, all of these scientists have realized that there is no such thing as a past, present, and future throughout the universe that's one thing. There's this block where all time is present at the same time somewhere. And that's fine. But we have to understand that this entirety of space, all of this finiteness, is inside God. God is outside of all of it and so sees all of it at the same time. One of the things I noted in my book, hate to plug my book, but here you go. The book is about the relationship between an infinite God and science and consciousness. That's what the whole thing is about. How what science has discovered in the last 20, 30, 40 years is not inconsistent with God's infinity. And one of the things I noted is that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and Heisenberg was a guy who was fundamental in quantum mechanics, and he said he proved that you cannot both know a location and a velocity of a particle at the same time. You can't have exact knowledge of both. And he proved this mathematically. That's fine, but it only applies inside the finite. God isn't limited by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. He can know the exact position and velocity of every particle in the universe simultaneously. And so somehow, even though we can't see time in this overall sense throughout the universe, God can. And that's basically my point.
Okay, Ted.
Well, thank you, Phil and Matt. This has been a great conversation. Just one point about Phil, where Phil had closed in saying God is both the geographical center of the universe of universes, and at the same time the center of each and every individual phenomenon. Automaton, well, I would say phenomenon, rather than commit myself to that metaphysics. But let me just say, I believe that too. So we don't really need to travel faster than the speed of light in order to catch up with God. I actually don't believe that. But and I consider that the holistic paradigm. God is the whole, and in that sense, also governing the parts, but also present in the parts. Mm-hmm. But I believe that metaphysically. I don't know of a way in which you can show that scientifically. So there's just going to have to be some commitments that I make, and I think for you too, that we're going to have to just go it without, the blessing of the scientific community. That's all.
I think they call that faith.
On that note, so I think it's time for questions, and we got a few minutes for that. So go ahead.
Thank you, gentlemen. Is it on? for a extremely stimulating conversation. I'm a little tired, so I'll do my best to be clear. First part of my question has to do with Bell's theorem and non-local causation. Could you address the relevance of that to the discussion that you've had? I think it actually clarifies your question, Ted, in terms of how things move fast in the speed of light. And then the second part is, I think I've answered it myself in thinking about it, but in terms of how God can know everything, and yet how can we be co-creating with him? That was one of the most powerful things that I got from the early presentation from Byron, is that it's a process theology, it's a co-creating. And Matt, you were so vehement in saying that God knows everything, and yet I think I know the answer now, but I'm still a little confused. So Bell's theorem, and then how can God know everything if we're co-creating?
Can I address that second part? I'll address the second part and see if Phil wants to take the first.
I'll be happy to take the first part.
Okay, let me quick do the second. So
Bell's theorem.
So good, because you'd be better at it than I would. So God is outside of time. He knows everything. He knows the end from the beginning, as the Urantia book says, which means there are no surprises to God. But we're inside time. We don't know what God knows. And so when we're faced with choices, we live in a present and a leading edge of a world line of history. And that leading edge includes all the firings going on in our brains right now. And we're presented with stimulus, and we are required to make a decision. Now, this is something that had been called theological fatalism. If God knows everything, how can we be free?
Right, predestination.
But that's the essential question. But the answer from the Urantia book's point of view is the reason is because God is outside time. He's not in time, and we are in time. And so what you might want to think of it as is we are free in time, even though God knows everything outside of it. We're free within it because we have no idea what
is that what the thought adjuster is? Is that what the thought adjuster is?
Well, the thought adjuster is a fragment, a piece of it's different than our personality. The Urantia book says it's pre-personal, and it's another mechanism. I've avoided talking about it because it just complicates the layers of things that we have residing inside us. But you might think of it this way. If you think you're alone inside your brain, you're not. God is there with you. He's living our lives with us. And whether we think of this, the Urantia book says you have all these spiritual influences around you, the spirit, the thought adjuster, the personality from the Father, Jesus' spirit of truth. But the Urantia book says we can't tell the difference between any of them, even though the Urantia book can tell us about all of them. From our own internal point of view, they're all spirit. It's all coordinated, and God's spirits, all these various things, are so perfectly coordinated that we can't tell one from the other. And that really has nothing to do with the question of free will versus what God knows. But the point that issue really comes down to our being free because we're stuck in time and we can't know what God knows of the future.
I heard you, but I still don't get it.
It's a conversation over dinner. One more question. You wanted to answer about Bell theorem.
Let me just respond very briefly to what you asked and what Matthew just said. The thought adjuster is not a time being, not conscious of time. And God doesn't decide everything ahead of time. So if there are still decisions to make, we can make decisions, and God can make decisions. But God hasn't already decided everything. It is a process. At least that's how I have tried to understand.
More comfortable with that answer than
that's how I've tried to understand. How could God know everything? While at the same time as I've got a choice about something. That would be inconsistent. So
particularly if we're co-creating.
Yeah. Now, with respect to to Bell's theorem.
Want to define what it is?
Yeah. Bell's theorem was proved by John Bell, who was a mathematician, to understand how it was that in quantum mechanical measurements that there were, and these have been done over and over again, they would split a particle and measure it at fairly relatively far distant, and they found that there was correlations between what would be measured here and what would be measured there, and the correlations couldn't have been caused by a transfer of information because there wasn't enough time for light to travel from one place to the other. So something is non-local about physics, about quantum physics.
And that made Einstein very uncomfortable.
It made Einstein very uncomfortable because he thought everything had to be at the speed of light or less. And there's something going on that's happening faster than that. So these quantum correlations, what did we do? We decided we'd make a wavicle. Well, it's a wave, and it's also a particle. We get, it's a wave so we can extend from one place to the else instantaneously. And at the same time, it's a particle because when you measure it, it comes out to be one place. And so physicists have jumped over backwards and tied themselves in knots trying to say that, well, it's only when you observe the thing does it become particular. And some people would say, you mean to tell me if no one's looking at the moon, it's not really out there, and it only, is there when we measure it?
That's solipsism. Yeah.
I mean, it's gotten really weird. So I think we need to realize that the universe is not just, time, light, speed of light integrated. There's something more going on. It may be above the mass level. It's not mass that's going from one place to the other. It's pre-mass. Energy
consciousness?
Force energy, fields. Fields are not material. They're in space.
Higgs boson?
And so it's possible somehow for you make a measurement here, something over here very far away somehow knows about it, and we're just learning about this. We're just learning about it, but it tells you that Einstein didn't know everything.
Right. Thank you so much.
One more question.
Before we get that, can I just make the Urantia book gives an example, and Phil makes a good point. God doesn't decide for us, but knowing and making a decision are two different things. And the Urantia book gives an example, although we're not God. You watch a 2-year-old crawl down the floor, and you know that 2-year-old is going to turn left and grab a rattle. And sure enough, 2-year-old turns left and grabs a rattle. 2-year-old's decision is still free, even though you knew what he was going to do. And that's the example it gives. But in this case, it's a knowledge in time. God's knowledge is even more perfect than that.
It's Ted.
The question of Bell's theorem rings a bell with me. I have a friend named Butch, and he read my book on the Trinity, and he didn't like the way it ended. I described to you the way it ended. And so he wrote his own book, published about a month or so ago, on Trinity and Entanglement, in which he follows exactly the road that was suggested here. Just a quickie, even though I like Matthew a lot, I just have to disagree with him. I don't think that God is out of time because I'm sort of an incarnationalist Christian. I do think that God is quite involved with time, making promises and delivering fulfillments incarnate in the historical Jesus or the Holy Spirit present in a Christian community. I think what God does is takes time up into eternity. But I think that at any given moment, God knows everything that can be known about the future, that is to say, every potential, but God does not know what's going to be actualized. God does not know what Matthew is going to eat for supper.
Oh.
God knows what the alternatives are, but he doesn't know what Matthew's going to choose. And within this frame of reference, inertial frame of reference, God doesn't know what Matthew's going to choose, but God does know what alternatives there are for Matthew to choose. So does that make God's knowledge finite? Well, only in a small sense, but I do think it means that the future is genuinely open even from God's point of view.
I think we're out of time, unfortunately, Buzz. I would urge you. Oh, no. Well, maybe, why don't you ask it, and we'll just do quickly. This is...
I feel like a hiccup here.
Oh, sorry, Buzz. I didn't mean to do that. This is Buzz Kellogg, who's professor at Sonoma State University. Go ahead and ask it.
Okay, here's a single question in 4 separate parts. I just want to. I was a little inspired by how Ted just responded to God and time. I have to confess, I really don't know what God thinks. But if he knows everything, he's missing out on humor. If he can't be surprised, there's no way you could ever tell him a joke. And I find that kind of I don't like that kind of a world. Yeah.
He lives with us.
Let me answer to that, because the supreme being is in time.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's where the God is.
Okay. Okay, just a couple of technical points. At the present time, the present state of particle physics interaction theories is that none of them is instantaneous, and they're all caused by exchange of particles, that is, Feynman particles. And so even gravity requires that, and gravity's not instantaneous. Mm-hmm. And you don't need gravity to hold everything together, because at different levels it really doesn't. It's exchange of virtual photons that holds them together. It's exchange of gluons that holds them together. At the gravitational level, it's exchange of gravitons. And for Matthew, it's not a problem about the Kobe irregularities of the background radiation of 3 degrees Kelvin if you read Lisa Randall's book, How the Universe Got Its Spots. She's a Harvard cosmologist. And
I've read one of her books, not that one.
Okay. And then the last one is, I was very unnerved sort of by, in the beginning of your talk, Phil, that you had a sort of a synthetic statement of some group of scientists or science evaluating the science in the Urantia book and then giving approbation that it was authoritative and very useful. I don't know what the source was. I don't know who said this.
No, that was in the Urantia book. It's a claim in the Urantia book that it's an authoritative elimination of error.
I totally mistook that. I thought that was an outside...
That's a quote. No, that was a quote.
Okay.
Thank you, Buzz.
Right.
We're going to continue this, Buzz.
Well, thank you. We're out of time. Thank you, everybody. This has been amazing. I just had one concluding statement, which was, God knows what you're going to be eating for dinner, but he does not want you to eat GMO food. So.